Okay, our topic for today is about proving parallel lines. So our first example is given that line A is parallel line B and then line C is parallel to line D, which means that A is parallel to line B and that also C is parallel to D. And then we need to prove that angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 13 right here. So we need to prove those two. In any proofs, the very first reason or the very first statement that we use is the given. That is most of the time, like 99% of the time, we are going to put the given on our statement, and then your reason is that it is given. Okay, now let's take a look at the next one where it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 12. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 12, and we all learned this. These two angles are alternate exterior angles, and so our reason is going to be alternate exterior angles theorem. Okay, so our next one is that angle 12 is congruent to angle 13, and we have learned this. This is alternate interior angle. So alternate interior angle theorem states that angle 13 is congruent to angle 12 if your lines are parallel and cut by a transversal. So our reason for angle 12 and angle 13 being congruent is the alternate interior angles theorem. And then now after saying that angle 1 is congruent to angle 12 and then angle 12 is congruent to angle 13, we can therefore conclude that angle 1 is congruent to angle 13 by the transitive property of congruence. So real quick, what is the transitive property? The transitive property states that if A is equal to B or congruent to B and B is congruent to C, therefore you can conclude that A is congruent to C. Okay, for example number 2, given that line A is parallel to line B, we need to put our marks to indicate that they're parallel. You will have to prove that the measure of angle 9 and plus the measure of angle 14 is gonna equal to 180 degrees. So once again, your first statement goes A parallel B, and that is the given. And then measure of angle 9 plus measure of angle 11, this right here, is equal to 180 degrees, and the reason for that is the linear pair postulate. Okay. And then now we are going to proceed to saying that measure of angle 11 is actually equal to measure of angle 14. And you see that they are alternate interior angles, and alternate interior angles are congruent. So we're going to use the alternate interior angle theorem. And now we can establish that measure of angle 9 plus measure of angle 14 is equal to 180 degrees by substitution. I will explain this a little bit. Okay, so let's look at this. Please understand that if you're saying that measure of angle 9 plus measure of angle 11 is equal to 180 degrees, and you're saying right here that the measure of angle 11 is equal to measure of angle 14, notice that I took this out and substituted it with 14. That's the meaning of substitution. Once two items are equal, you can take out the other one and replace it for the other one. So for my next example, I already wrote the reason for you because that's given. So given that line G is parallel line H and that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, prove that line P is parallel to line R. Alright, so angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 by the corresponding angle theorem. And then angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 by substitution. So if 1 is congruent to angle 2 and 1 is congruent to angle 3, since these two are congruent, I can just take the 2 and say angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And that's the meaning of substitution. And now it's going to be corresponding angle converse. That's how you prove that a line P is parallel to line R. Alright, so you are going to set this up to where your first statement, of course, is going to be your given. So G is parallel H, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 5 by the reason of its given. So angle G parallel to angle H. Alright, and we are going to have to prove that angle 5 is going to be congruent to angle 3, and based off of this, it says that angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. Okay, I'm now going to number this, but I'm going to give you a while to think about how this can help to make us prove that angle 5 is congruent to angle 3. Think about it for a little bit. So very good. Your next statement should be that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 with the reason of corresponding angle theorem. And then now we're about done, because now that these are all given, if you can see this and this, okay, you can already conclude that angle 5 is congruent to angle 3, and this time I just want to use transitive property. So let's proceed to our example number 5. Given that line G is parallel to line H and that angle 6 and 3 are supplementary, all I will have to do first is to write them down here. We need to prove that angle 6 is going to be congruent to angle 2. Okay? So, this is now for the reason of given. I want you to take a while to think of what your sentence or statement number 2 should be to be able to prove that angle 6 is congruent to angle 2, given that angle 6 and angle 3 are supplementary. Okay, I want you to notice that your 6 and 3 are related by being supplementary, and then you are going to prove that 6 is congruent to angle 2. So I want to focus on these two angles right here, and I'm going to say that angle 2 and angle 3 are also supplementary. And I am permitted to say that by the consecutive interior angle theorem. Consecutive interior angle theorem states that if your two lines are parallel, cut by a transversal, the interior angles on the same side of the transversal are equal to 180 degrees, which means that they are supplementary. So let's go ahead and try this last and final example. Segment CD is parallel segment AB. Okay. And then angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. So you're establishing that these two are congruent. Let me just make the mark. And so you wanted to prove that angle 2 is also congruent to angle 3. You wanted to find out if that will be, or you wanted to prove if that will be congruent to angle 2 as well. So again, for this proof, the first statement that you're going to have is that segment CD is parallel to segment AB, and that angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. And we are permitted to say that by the reason that it is given. Your goal is to prove that angle 2 is going to be congruent to angle 3. Your givens are this segment is parallel to that segment, as well as angle 2 and angle 1 being congruent. Okay, very good. After waiting on some people to respond, one of you had said that angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 3. And that is because of the alternate interior angle theorem. Okay, after saying that, you are now permitted. This is a very clear transitive right here. If angle 2 is congruent to angle 1 and angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, therefore angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. This is a very clear transitive property of equality.